Is everyone ready for constructive? Cool. Since that's the case, time starts on my first word. We argue that the benefits of executive orders, or EOs, outweigh the harms. Currently, Congress is extremely inefficient due to deep division. Warburton 24 finds that just 27 bills were passed last year, a record low. But even before that, the number of bills signed into law has been falling. Thankfully, EOs are vital to breaking the norm of inaction by providing two key benefits. Contention one is structuring statutes. EOs are critical for giving structure to unclear, complicated laws passed by Congress. Francis 25 writes that EOs can be instrumental in clarifying ambiguities in existing laws. When Congress passes broad or vague legislation, the executive branch is responsible for implementation. EOs can provide federal agencies with specific instructions on how to enforce these laws efficiently and uniformly. An example is the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, which was created to make U.S. foreign aid more efficient. Page 25 reports that USAID was created by President Kennedy through a 1961 EO. And Nick Meyer 25 explains that Kennedy wanted more efficient foreign assistance and saw the State Department as frustratingly bureaucratic at doing that. That move was crucial for improving U.S. foreign aid delivery, stepping up from prior programs like the Mutual Security Agency. As Atwood 18 finds, the Mutual Security Agency combines security assistance with an aid program influenced primarily by geostrategic objectives. This was a program driven by ideological competition. Development was a secondary importance. Military and economic aid were then separated as the Mutual Security Agency became U.S. aid. The impact is lives. Cavalcanti 25 quantifies that over the past 2 decades, U.S. aid-funded programs have helped prevent 91 million deaths. Contention 2 is curing crises. In times of national crises, fast action is needed, but Congress is too little, too late for 3 reasons. First is local interests. Calabresi 95 argues that members will be first and foremost interested in policy preferences of their small districts and states. Interests will start to greatly affect national policy as regional interests kidnap federal law processes. Second is having too much work. Calabresi continues that inefficiencies become more likely as Congress tries to wear the hats of legislator and executive. The minute some portion of the executive is cut free from the president, it will be swallowed up by political pressures that drive congressional committees. Third is the partisan divide. Dashwell 20 explains that we live in a period of dynamic electoral competition between Republicans and Democrats. In such an environment, there's little incentive for those in Congress to compromise and potentially hand the other party a winning message for the next election. Such was the case during COVID, as Cusack 20 writes that Congress was ill-prepared to handle the pandemic. Turbocharged partisanship contributed to a late response to the coronavirus as lawmakers in both parties underestimated the crisis. Specifically, Lucia 20 finds that the $25 billion directed by Congress for COVID testing was inadequate given the scale of testing and follow-up needs. Thankfully, the president can act quickly through EOs to resolve crises, as Fierro 21 contends that EOs allow a president to enact policies quickly without waiting for congressional approval. EOs are a valuable tool for presidents in times of national crises. During COVID, Young 21 reports that Biden called on the U.S. federal government to combat COVID under 10 new executive orders to accelerate manufacturing in masks, isolation gowns, testing swabs, and vaccine materials. Among the actions Biden took through EOs was establish a COVID pandemic testing board to increase testing capacity. Santos 25 specifies that the executive branch of the U.S. created the Testing and Diagnostics Working Group, a task force responsible for coordinating with industry to maximize national testing capacity. Such COVID testing was critical. Santos quantifies that increased government actions towards testing capacity saved 1.4 million lives. Preparing for similar public health crises is especially important, as Peralta 21 warns that the last 4 pandemics occurred every 15 years, and the occurrence of pandemics is getting more frequent over time as urbanization increases contact among wildlife, livestock, and humans, leading to new pandemics. The impact is lives. Pandemics are deadly, as Datani 24 writes that the COVID pandemic caused 27 million deaths. Thus, we affirm. Thank you.
Send case. Okay, Daniel's gonna send case. Let me know when you get it, and then we'll be good for constructive. And then for judges' reference, my name is Selma Barani. I'll be speaking first for the negation 1215. I believe the case is signed.
Still, yeah, just got it. Same here.
Perfect. Anyone not ready? Great. From the start, our founders built a government for balance, not one-man rule. Congress is meant to represent every voice. The president was never meant to govern alone. But that balance is fading as presidents increasingly bypass Congress and rule by executive order. Thus, 1215 negates. Our sole argument is executive overreach. As Hevia Villanova law explains, executive orders were meant to allow the president to carry out Congress's will. For a while, that vision was upheld. Purcell in 2025 notes that George Washington issued just 8 executive orders and they were used sparingly, not as a form of daily governance. But that line began to blur. As the nation expanded, executive orders shifted from necessity to convenience. Regulatory expert Dan Bosch noted that presidents stopped waiting for Congress and began acting alone. In the past 5 decades, they've averaged 260 orders per term, using a tool meant to serve democracy to now sidestep it. To be clear, we are not saying all executive orders are bad, but the pattern of their overuse erodes the foundation of our democracy. And today they pose 2 serious harms. The first is bypassing Congress. Congress does 3 things executive orders never can. The first is that Congress holds public hearings, calls experts, and asks hard questions that examine every aspect of a policy. The second is that Maryland University finds it brings together voices from every state and background, red and blue, urban and rural, accurately representing our nation and not just one individual agenda. Third, while executive orders may deliver quick wins, long-lasting progress comes only through negotiation and compromise. When we skip this process, people get hurt. As health experts warned against cutting HIV aid, Congress listened, but the president didn't. That's why GHP in 2025 reports that one executive order slashed HIV aid, leading to 100,000 preventable deaths. But when we trust the system, lives are saved. In 2017, Congress passed the ACE Kids Act with bipartisan support. Cornell University found it helped 300,000 children get critical care across state lines. The second net harm is regressive reversals. Once a president signs an executive order, checks are scarce. Congress has overturned only a handful, and the Supreme Court has struck down fewer than a dozen in over 230 years. By the time they act, the damage is already done. As the ACLU warns, even reckless orders go unchecked if they're technically legal. This leeway has distorted the original purpose of executive orders, as Biron Tao of the Associated Press found that nearly a fifth of the last 150 executive orders cited a national emergency, a sharp rise signaling a shift in how presidents govern. What was once for true crisis is now used to bypass Congress and push stalled agendas. It's not just overuse, it's instability. As the Congressional Research Service reports, presidents issue twice as many orders in their final months, driven by politics, not policy. And because new presidents can reverse them instantly via another executive order, the result is constant policy whiplash. National Affairs estimates this has already cost the U.S. economy $1.7 trillion. But even beyond that, the impact is not just economic. Brownstein from AP writes that redoing climate regulations between administrations has left companies confused. Instability from re-entering and withdrawing from the Paris Agreement has caused 25,000 deaths from emissions each year. Karkako from NYT furthers that since Obama passed DACA, an immigration policy for children, each administration has reversed it again and again, leaving 135 million without a future. Professor Goldstein writes that President Truman's executive order created loyalty review boards, enabling the Red Scare. It led to 12,000 public servants being fired and imprisoned on whispers of communist affiliations, a devastating mistake made via executive order that Truman himself later admitted he hadn't thought through. There's a line between leadership and convenience. Unchecked executive power doesn't just bypass Congress, it erodes democracy. Thus, Daniel and I are proud to negate.
Awesome. Are you ready for the crossfire?
Yeah.
Since I spoke first, may I have the first question?
Go ahead.
Cool. Let's start time with my first question. Let's go into your first argument about Congress, right? You tell me that Congress passed the ACE Kids Act, which saved 300,000 kids, right?
Correct.
Yeah, this is in the status quo where we have executive orders, right?
Yeah, the reason why we propose this in constructive is to provide a comparison. What we're comparing it to is something that you yourself talk about, US aid. When we passed HIV funding via executive order, we saw that because it was unstable, that funding actually got cut just a couple months later, and because we went back and forth with this unstable executive order, instead of doing permanent policy via Congress like with the ACE Kids Act, we had 100,000 preventable deaths. But can I take a question?
Sure.
Okay, let's talk about representation. Is the president or Congress a better representation of the nation as a whole?
The nation as a whole, I'd say the president is.
Why?
Because the president is elected nationally.
Okay, does the president represent every single demographic of the United States?
Yeah, obviously they don't. But our argument is that the
So
president
wouldn't
is
you
still better
say-
in many instances, such as during crises, in which we need a leader to step up instead of Congress
Hold
to
on,
take their time.
that doesn't
to
really
agree
answer
to
my
do
question.
things.
I'm asking about representation. You just said that the president doesn't represent every single demographic of the United States. At the point where we see that Congress in fact does, because it's representative of every single political party. Not only that, every single race and or most races and gender, that we see that we are passing better policy and it's more long lasting because it's deliberated by. So how can you make the claim that the president is uniquely key or uniquely more representative?
Once again, right, our argument isn't that the president should be the only person who does things in government, right? Our argument is that executive orders step up when Congress can. Congress is important for the reasons you explained.
Yeah, but wouldn't you
Congress
say-
can't act, wait, really quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
Congress isn't able to act in the times where we need fast and swift and sufficient action to solve things such as
Okay,
crises, such as
you're
we saw
talking a
before.
lot about
That's when the
speed,
president
but
comes
the
here with
implication that
executive
I'm
orders.
trying to make here is that because the president isn't representative, when they use speed, they make hasty decisions based off their own biases and their own impressions of what they believe is correct. And that's not representative of what the nation needs as a whole. So you say that executive orders are really, really quick, but Congress has been quick to respond to crises as well. But again,
Once
you can
right,
take a
that's
question.
a claim we can contest later, but I'll take
Sure,
a question.
go ahead.
Let's go on to your argument about, your second argument about reversals, right?
Mhm.
So overall, does having policy that's able to be flexible and be changed, do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing?
I mean, if it's flexible and changed for the good or greater good, then yeah, I would say it's a good thing. But the reason why policy reversals isn't good is because it's not just flexible or we're tweaking something that's been bad. We're completely reversing it, which means that every 4 years, when a new president steps into office, they're going to almost completely reverse everything the prior president had done. And in the time frame that we're relying on this short-term, very fragile policy, we could be passing stronger policy via Congress. That's why when we entered the Paris Treaty Agreement via executive order, then exited it and entered it again, we saw emissions increase and 25,000 people die every year. But yet with Congress and the ACE Kids Act, the resolution that allowed for the ACE Kids Act actually stably allowed for, 300,000 kids to access healthcare.
We have 3 minutes of prep time because we haven't used any of our prep time so far.
That is correct. So you're using some now.
Yes,
Yeah.
perfect. We'll start
Nice
that
work.
now.
I think you should just also go for the fact that they give you 3 reasons about how Congress is not working right now, but at the point where they concede that the president is a representative, it's an independent reason why you're voting for this. Because although they make quick reactive responses to crises, it's not in the best interest of the nation. So speed doesn't always equate to a good decision. You have to phrase it as though it's not just our 3 reasons versus theirs. It's our 3 reasons apply to all the scopes of this debate, because if you don't believe that the president makes decisions in the best interest of the nation, then executive orders are inherently bad.
Are you saying?
It's not just our 3 reasons versus theirs. It's the fact that if the president doesn't accurately represent the nation as a whole, then they can't make unilateral decisions. They're inherently bad. That should be something you question when you think about every single executive order. Also, I don't really know what the response about how US aid and HIV plays into this. Will you explain a rebuttal? What is it?
They're gonna say
That was minute 40 I have here.
That's
HIV
what I
guns
have to-
doesn't matter because
rebuttal is
executive
just
orders
that,
created
so
USA,
let me know.
which outweighs the
That we
goods.
receive.
Yeah.
But almost
And yeah, we have minute 20 remaining.
long-standing would have been better.
Or you can ascend and talk.
Perfect. While that's happening, 1076, again, affirmative. The order of this speech will just be responding to my opponent's case. Awesome. 12:15, are we good?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Since that's the case, time will begin on my first word. let's start off at the top of my opponent's case. They make this argument about executive overreach, but they neglect all the checks and balances which currently exist. Farhadian 23 explains that although the power of the presidents has increased incrementally since the founding, it has grown not at the expense of the other two branches. Whatever power the president has from issuing executive orders, there are numerous mechanisms put in place to ensure that unilateral actions do not disrupt the systems of checks and balances, but rather enforce it. History is on our side. We have had executive orders for over 200 years since the very founding of this nation, yet they claim that policy has consistently been flip-flopped. But that's not true, because we've consistently seen that economic growth and investment in climate technology specifically has always been increasing in America if you look at the long-term trend holistically. They just like to isolate a few specific examples and claim that it's representative of the whole. But secondly, an important thing to note is that naturally they themselves agree that there have been good and bad executive orders. An important question needs to be answered. Would these acts have been passed in a world without the executive order? Wetzel 07 concludes that without executive orders, bad policy would still find its way into the law books because all three branches of government are fallible. That means that the bad policy that they try to highlight is not a fault of the executive order itself, but rather it represents the fallibility of all humans. Exceptions do not disprove the rule. Let's get on more specifically to their first argument about bypassing Congress. The biggest thing to note is that there's little evidence to prove this is the case. During 99 explains that studies have found little systematic evidence that executive orders are used to circumvent a hostile Congress. Presidents do use executive orders, but not if they are likely to be overturned, as the use of executive orders reflects both their ability to achieve and to maintain preferred changes to the policy status quo. More specifically, on this first argument about public hearings, we'd say that the president could still listen to experts in the field specifically when he's crafting executive orders. There's no reason why this isn't true. But also, they try to tell you that this is extremely essential when crafting policy. Even if that's true, Congress can take this role, but in times of crisis, when there isn't enough time to act, you simply don't have enough time to have a public hearing about every single issue. This also responds to their argument about having people from every single background represented. In times of crisis, intensive action needs to be taken immediately, and there simply isn't any possible way to make policy while including everyone, which is why the Constitution itself vests so much power in a unitary executive. They then make this argument about how policy is long-lasting. Let's first recognize the fact that most executive orders actually stay in place. Farhadian 23 explains that there are endless examples that show that while executive orders can be controversial and viewed as subverting the legislative process, they are not permanent but easily reversible. But this is another check. For example, from 1937 to 2013, 6,158 executive orders were issued, 18% were amended, 8% were superseded, but only 25% were revoked. The fact that executive orders can be changed is not a flaw, but rather a strength that the policy-making ability of the president is flexible and can be changed with the times. But even then, Dodds 13 continues that the average executive order remained unchanged for 12 years on average, which means a lot of their examples simply aren't holistic. Then, on this second argument, or two clarifications are key here actually. The first is that revoked executive orders tend to be partisan and highly contentious. In most of these cases, a divided Congress would not have been able to pass any policy at all, which we'd argue that some short-term action is better than none. This specifically implicates to their argument about the Paris Climate Accords, because remember, we joined with an executive order. In a world without the executive order, there wouldn't have been any joining of Paris at all. But secondly is that popular progressive executive orders often endure, because once embedded in public life, reversing them becomes politically costly. That's why landmark orders like the Emancipation Proclamation or Truman's desegregation of the military were never undone. And that's because the political costs of revoking executive orders frequently is far too high. Branamo 2 explains that once a president has signed an executive order, he often makes it impossible for a subsequent administration to undo his action without enduring political fallout. As Clinton issued a slew of executive orders on environmental issues, Bush found himself unable to reverse orders without invoking the ire of environmentalists. As a result, we're proud to affirm.
Code 112 is going to start running prep now. 12.
No, wait, the end, like, all of it about, remember, they're confusing reversals with revokes, like, we're getting revoked. Like, reversals are not a form of checks because it's not checking the constitutionality, it's just, like, based off the president's, like, inherent political opinion. And then, like, just emphasize that even though average EOs are, like, stay in place, the fact that so, like, an
That was 138. For everyone's reference, I'm Daniel. I'm the second speaker for 1215. The order's gonna go con, pro. I'll defend my arguments and then go into their arguments. They open up by saying that America has grown and that we should be looking at broad trends, but we argue you should look at actual specifics because when you analyze EOs, the structures of them show that they only bypass Congress and lead to harmful policy. Specifically on our first argument on bypassing Congress, they say that bad policy will happen anyway. But guess what? We would argue that it is a lot less likely for Congress to make a bad policy or courts to because the president is just one person. The framers define that no president should just rule alone, and Congress, which means representatives from all over the country, can deliberate a lot better, but it is a lot worse with the president, which is why executive orders always lead to more bad policy. Then they say that you don't have to do it through Congress and they can still listen to experts. But the problem is the president doesn't do that anymore. Any single time the Congress doesn't pass it, for example, HIV funding, Congress rejected it, health experts warned the president not to, and yet unresponded to HIV cuts were still cut through executive order, leading to 100,000 deaths that cannot be reversed. Lastly, they say that we need times of speed in a crisis. This is the exact justification presidents use whenever there's some sort of emergency crisis when they want to enact their own agenda. They've dropped the evidence that the past 150 executive orders, 1/5 of them are now cited under national emergencies, even when there isn't any. It is just presidents asserting their own agenda to bypass Congress when they could have been acting and consulting with our representatives. Then, on our argument on policy reversals, they say it's a check and balance, but that is not our argument. The fact that executive orders are fragile and are constantly checked leads to regulations and from climate policy to immigration being unsure and the people about them being harmed because they have no future or no clarification of what the U.S. did. Rather, if Congress actually passed something substantive like the ACE Kids Act, you could have lasting policy which has already saved over 300,000 kids with health care. Then they say most last on average 12 years on average. That's fine. We are specifically isolating executive orders that are politically targeted. For example, immigration, which has left over 135 million immigrants across the world with no clarification on legal policy. Yes, not every executive order is overturned, but the ones that are due hurt the most. Then they say short term is better. No, it is not, because for example, during the own Paris agreements, people and companies that were trying to adapt to the Paris Agreement had to constantly change regulation back and forth, which is worse because no policy means that we don't get anything done and why emissions are still increasing and 25,000 people have died every single year. Lastly, they say it's hard to do because of political capital, but notice how all their examples are outdated. Remember that the past 150 executive orders, 1/5 of them have been cited under national emergencies, and it's because the president just wants to enact their own unilateral agenda. With that said, let's talk about their arguments. First, on their first argument, we would argue two things. That one, broadly with all their arguments, Congress can pass something a lot faster, which means executive orders are irrelevant. But two, even if they prove that they work together, Congress and executive orders, the reason why executive orders aren't relevant is because in most of these cases, Congress will specifically ask in the laws to give emergency powers to the president under statutory authority. What does this mean? It means all the executive orders weren't necessary. Let's go over their specific examples. But firstly, quickly on this USAID. Remember that HIV cuts themselves already killed 100,000 people when we could have been doing something with Congress substantive that would have lasted, for example, the ACE Kids Act. But more specifically on their argument on curing crisis. Remember, first of all, they say that we need to bypass representation. But why is representation bad? We would argue that congressional deliberation is important because it allows us to bad good policy. But moreover, what Hamilton finds is that during times of crisis, Congress can act quickly because it recognizes the need during times of crisis. Let's look at their example in COVID. For example, Glassman finds that before the first executive order was even enacted, Congress passed 3 bills, including the CARES Act, which was the largest economic stimulus package in American history. Not only this, it contained Operation Warp Speed, which delegated the funding for vaccines that they told you were so crucial. Another example is the American Post Association Act, which was passed near Biden's term, which allocated funding for vaccines. These all gave the statutory authority to give Congress and the president to pass these mobilizations in the first place, proving that you didn't need executive orders. It is only about bypassing Congress, which hurts.
I don't believe we got a document for the evidence you cited there. Could you send the evidence that you read?
Yeah, just all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Once we get the evidence, I'll run it. Yeah.
Check out. What?
Okay, AAR sent, and then like the ACE Kids Act, and then like HIV cuts were already sent.
Okay,
Yeah.
Awesome. We'll let you know when we get it.
Oh, there's just another act on here. It was the American. It's just another act. Like the 3-year-one. Yeah, the American Rescue Act.
Thanks.
We just got it. We have a minute 20 of prep remaining. We'll continue running that starting now.
Wait, I think this is good. I think that was good.
55 seconds on mine. Awesome. We have 25 remaining.
Good for cross.
Yeah. You want to sit up?
Yeah.
It's up to you.
Yeah, we can stand here. It's fine.
Okay.
Awesome. Do you mind if I get the first question?
Go for it.
Okay, let's start the time now. Let's talk about this CARES Act, right?
Yes.
So the CARES Act appropriated funding, correct?
Correct.
So how is this funding actually used, like by agencies? What instrument directed this funding to be mobilized for things like, vaccine distribution or PPE production?
It was a public-private partnership. For example, vaccines was raised under a provision called Operation Warp Speed. This was a specific provision in the CARES Act delegated by Congress that gave the president the authority to mobilize agencies and distribute vaccines. But can we take a question?
Really quickly, do you mind if I get a follow-up?
Of course.
Isn't it also true that executive orders were passed during that same time period to actually allow for this funding to be used for the very same things we're talking about?
Yeah, that's true, but they
Okay.
weren't actually necessary. You're going to say that executive orders were the only way to mobilize this, but the reason why these executive orders were introduced, not because they're out of necessity, it's just the president wanted to make a public statement that he was doing it. Specifically, the statutory authority that is derived from the CARES Act and Operation Warp Speed, for example, BARDA, are authorities given to the president during times of emergencies. The reason is because when there's an actual emergency, Congress gives specific appropriations and emergency powers in the bill authorizing it. There's no need for an executive order. The difference is when a president issues an executive order on their own, they're bypassing Congress. But can we take a question?
Okay, yeah, sure. We'll get back to this.
So let's talk about this argument on USAID. Why wouldn't we have done something more substantive through Congress when it could just be cut, for example, HIV funding, which killed 100,000 people?
Wait, our argument functions on two levels. The first is that the organization of USAID itself wouldn't even exist without the executive order, right? That's our own case analysis.
Right.
But the second is that the interim time for which USAID did exist, it has provided so many benefits,
Right.
91 million lives saved, that the congressional cuts you talk about, the benefits don't the harms don't outweigh the benefits.
Right. We understand that USAID has been good, but we are arguing why should it have been passed through executive order when it could have gone through Congress and then not been subject to cuts and been a lot better.
Wait, I don't understand how this argument functions because the Congress itself right now is red, albeit by razor thin margins.
USAID was not created last year. It was during Congress. It was created back in the 70s.
But I'm talking about the political motivation for cuts is only a recent thing. In a world without the executive order, our argument about bad policy is that in this world without the executive order, the cuts you talk about would still happen.
Again,
because the political motivation to
that
do so
still doesn't answer.
exists
That doesn't
in
answer my
Congress.
question. Why should we have an executive order when Congress could have established the agency a lot better, where it wouldn't have been subject to cuts? Where instead we have to have policy reversal and fragile spending.
Okay, so that argument makes no sense because it's not like Congress can just create an agency and say,
Yeah, they can.
Wait, you didn't let me finish. It's not like Congress can create an agency and say you're immune from all budget cuts ever, right?
No, but it's less than the
agencies
president with
the
executive
agencies which
order.
Congress has created are subject to budget cuts all the time, right? It's not something that Congress can really do.
Name me one.
What do you mean? The Department of Homeland Security, their budget gets cut sometimes.
Very rarely, and also I don't.
Nobody
think so.
can, and that's the
Sure,
thing.
they can, but it
That's
wasn't
us.
mentioned.
All right, is everyone ready for summary? Awesome. For the judges, a brief off-time roadmap. The order will start with our arguments, some weighing, and then our opponents. Since everyone's ready, time starts on my first word. At the top of our page, recognize that throughout this whole round, my opponents make two key flaws. First, they tell you to focus on the specifics instead of the holistic in an on-balance topic. And second, they always assert that if the executive order hasn't happened, Congress would have magically done it. Let's break this down as to why these are flaws in our specific arguments. On our first argument about structuring statutes and the US aid, they tell you a couple things. They first tell you that Congress can pass things a lot faster. But once again, they've never once responded to any of the three warrants, such as local interests being represented first, Congress having too much on their plate, and them being focused on electoral victories instead of passing policies, as to why Congress is gridlocked and often can't pass policies. That's why, although Congress authorized the president to create US aid, the president was necessary to actually enforce it. This deals with their next response, saying that the president didn't do much. They did much. They are the executive branch. They use executive orders to actually enforce and create the details of US aid, which is what saved 91 million lives. They then tell you that Trump killed 100,000 people through cuts to US aid. But remember, it's an on-balance topic. If US aid was created by the executive order in the first place and saved 91 million lives, it is on net a good thing. Because without it, US aid wouldn't be there in the first place. There would be so many more people lost. Finally, they talk about Congress again. I've already dealt with this. Let's go into the more important argument, which is our second on crisis. What we tell you is very simple. Congress is too slow because they do things like log rolling, represent local interests first, they have too much on their plate at once, and they prefer to win elections instead of pass policy. That's why during COVID, they were too slow to act, and their initial actions were not enough for COVID testing. Until President Biden stepped up with his executive order, creating the COVID testing board, which ultimately saved 1.4 million lives. My opponents say two things. They first tell you representation is good. We agree, but not in times of crisis when it creates things like log rolling because different districts and states want different amounts of money and a finite sum of funding. That's what slowed down the process for Congress. That's why it sucks during crises. Second, they tell you Congress did a lot with funding. That's true. That's Congress's job with appropriating funding. But how it's executed and actually enforced under agencies, such as Biden creating the testing board via executive order, that's all the executive order. That's why uniquely they've conceded the Santos evidence that Biden saved 1.4 million lives. Let's go to the weighing here. Recognize that solving crisis should come first on your ballot, because if we have crises decimate this country, we cannot access any benefit that they talk about. Immigration reform, healthcare, climate change policy, none of that can happen if we have a pandemic or something other crisis ravaging our country. That is a prerequisite to solve crises in the first place. Let's go to their case then. At the top with overreach, remember the overall response that overreach does not happen with presidential executive orders because of checks and balances through things like Congress and the court. They themselves tell you that, president is always worse at making policy because of one person. Remember, the president isn't the only one acting within the executive. They have so many policy councils and agencies that they themselves create. On the first argument of Congress, remember that on net, our evidence indicates that they don't bypass Congress because it's politically unpopular. And more important, they supplement Congress. All the reasons why Congress is good, that's great. The presidential executive order adds more. That's why the AIDS Kids Act was passed during executive orders. On their second, remember that on net, the executive order lasts 12 years. There's no reversal because there's no political appetite for constant reversals and a pendulum. Thus, we affirm. Thank you.
Cool. Code 1215 will be starting running prep now.
Can I just extend the 1/5 on bypassing Congress as the response? Is that enough?
On what?
Bypassing Congress. Or do you want me to send you a state?
Yeah, like it's only used to justify, and also remember that like not every executive order is like overturned or like checked back, but the politically charged ones that are bad.
Yeah, they said that I got that.
Yeah.
If US aid is created via executive orders, it's good. What should I say?
You need to evaluate the benefits. If it never existed in the first place and was evaluated by Congress, that way it wouldn't be structured to cuts. And like dismantling and 100,000 people wouldn't have died. And then also, like on COVID, they concede that every single power didn't need to be through EO. Like Operation Warp Speed gave the specific negation.
Okay. Yeah, I got it. The order of my speech is going to be addressing the negations arguments first, then onto the weighing debate or comparative both sides, and then finally addressing the affirmations arguments. Is anyone not ready to begin? Perfect. The first argument you're voting on in this round today is our argument on bypassing Congress, where we tell you that executive orders have been used to overpass the system of checks and balances. We see that executive orders are often pushed by the president's own agenda. That's why they haven't responded to the empiric that 1/5 of 150 executive orders in the past couple of years have been pushed by false crises and false emergencies. There's not a single response to this. But at the point where they agree that HIV cuts happened because executive orders are unstable, when instead we could go through Congress and pass stuff like the ACE Kids Act that saved 300,000 kids by giving them access to health care, you buy that when legislation goes through Congress, it's better than executive orders. And that's what happens, that's why executive orders are bad. But the second place you're voting is argument on reversals, where we tell you that the reason why executive orders are even worse than, even more bad, is because they constantly get reversed. We see that the Paris Treaty, for example, 25,000 people died every single year because we entered into the Paris Treaty, then left it, then entered it again. All these reversals prevent us from making long-term policy that happens through Congress. They only say one thing. They say that most policy lasts for 12 years. However, they drop two things. Number one, that it's the politically charged executive orders that are being targeted for reversals that are really bad because they talk about problems like immigration, like DACA, where we saw 135 million kids have really uncertain beliefs about their future staying in the country because they didn't know what, because of reversals. But the same thing with climate change. But then lastly, they drop the analysis that the short term is not the better result here, because when we have short-term consistent regulation changes, it leads to nothing being done. When nothing is being done, you don't have any effective policy that solves for any of the problems they're talking about. Now on to the weighing debate. They make this prerequisite that you have to solve for crisis first. But I would say that the prerequisite is actually that you can't solve for crisis if policy is constantly being reversed at every single turn. When policy is always being reversed, you never actually solve for crisis. But they don't actually prove that Congress is slow. In fact, Congress is first to respond, and that's where they lose their own arguments. Firstly, they tell you that local interest and at the congressional level has led them to fail back from having too much work to do. Those are great warrants, but at the end of the day, Congress reacted first during COVID, and they dropped this response. Remember that executive orders don't matter because Congress gives statutory powers to the president to respond during acts of crises. That's why during COVID-19, we saw that the provisions in the bill for the CARES Act was not only passed before executive order, meaning Congress can act first, but not only that, the provisions allowed for Project Warp Speed to happen, allowing them to actually access the vaccines that they themselves talk about. All those lives flow to our side in the debate. But then remember, they talk a lot about U.S. aid and how it was created via executive orders, and that's good. If U.S. aid didn't exist, it wouldn't have been cut, meaning that executive orders are inherently bad. The last thing is that they concede that the statutory powers allow the president to respond to crisis. That's probably the best place to vote because it's terminal defense. At the point, you're always voting for the negation in this round.
Okay.
We have 25.
We have 25 seconds of pub time remaining. Before grand calls, we'll use that all starting now. That's all we have. Yeah.
Yeah,
Awesome. Since we spoke first, can I get the first one?
go ahead.
All right, let's start time now. Let's go on to something you say early on in the summary that 1/5 of the past 150 executive orders were false crises or emergencies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how many executive orders have there been issued, ever?
I don't know, 14,000?
Actually 15,000, right? So about 100
my
times
bad.
the amount that you look at,
15,000.
right? Shouldn't we look at a bigger sample size to actually evaluate the on-balance benefits and harms of executive orders?
I mean, not necessarily, because now we're debating about executive orders and their nature. Just because the past was mostly it, our evidence shows that it was now trending towards a time where executive orders are no longer being used to actually justify national emergencies. All the emergencies now are entirely false, and because of this, it means that the next president and every single president after that is going to use the same thing.
Really quickly, right? Could I get a follow-up there?
Yeah.
If you suggest that we look at the nature of executive orders instead of just only look at specific examples, right? Shouldn't the nature of executive orders be showed out through the entire history of executive orders, not only 1% of the 15,000 that have been passed?
It's not an isolated incident. It's a trend. If the past 150 executive orders are now showing a trend that we're seeing justified national emergencies when there is no emergency, it's setting a precedent for the rest of executive orders to follow the same path, which is why, like, literally every single empiric in this debate, you haven't proven a reason why we need executive orders, and the only executive orders that are passed are killing people, like HIV funding cuts, which killed 100,000 worldwide.
A fifth of a percent determines the trend of 15,000 executive orders, just to be clear.
No, it's a recent trend that's going to prove, like, in the future. Like, a simple analogy is, like, take, for example, like, automobiles in the past. When automobiles were first created, everyone thought they were terrible because they were super expensive. But once, Ford developed, like, the supply chain and it started getting faster, even though, like, at that moment, automobiles weren't that great, once it started getting faster, it proved in the future, like, in the long run, we would see, like, they are useful. So the past shows that the future can change.
But that wasn't 1% of automobiles created, right? Like, a lot of automobile development started immediately after World War II. That isn't a thing we've seen for, like, only the past, like, few years within automobiles.
Yeah, but at that time we didn't know. Like, this is just an analogy. But the point is, like, executive orders have now evolved beyond their point.
Okay, sure. Braden, you can get it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Can we talk about, like, COVID? So why specifically did executive orders need to be used when every single act that the president could have done could have been used through statutory authority?
Well, the answer is that it wasn't done through statutory authority with Congress.
But
right?
why?
We read you 3 Mortensen case as to why Congress is systematically too slow to react in crisis, right? You talk about the CARES Act, but you've also conceded to the fact that this legislation simply wasn't enough, right? 1.4 million additional lives were saved, not through congressional legislation.
I mean,
but
the
through
warrants you
presidential
give are
executive
great, but looking at the empiric of what actually happened, the CARES Act that was passed had the provision that included Project Warp Speed and set the ground for that to happen. It issued the ability for the president to provide aid via vaccines. So we're saying that in the, like, hypothetically, your warrants, sure, maybe they make sense, but in the real world, what happened was Congress acted first.
Okay. Is everyone ready for final focus?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. For the judges, as an off-time roadmap, the order of this speech will be covering the key points of clash in today's debate and how you can vote for the affirmative, and it'll start off with my opponent's case. And since everyone's ready, time will begin on my first word. The first reason to affirm is because we're winning their case. Remember the checks and balances response. The executive order that they themselves tell you about is not some end-all be-all power for the executive. All of the executive orders and the majority of the ones which were problematic, which they talk about, were held up either by Congress and or the court system. That uniquely means that the problematic executive orders they talk about aren't going to proliferate in the future, and that's why 200 years of history proves that the executive order has been a stable power for this nation. More specifically, on this first argument about bypassing Congress, remember, we're the only team that actually reads holistic evidence on this issue, and it finds that there isn't political appetite to actually bypass Congress, and as a result, it's not a very long-term trend, and it isn't seen with the majority of executive orders. That leads me to their second argument about reversal. Remember, once again, we're the only team actually reading evidence about the long-term, the holistic view of executive orders. And remember, this is a benefits-harms resolution, where you as a judge must evaluate whether all of the benefits outweigh all of the harms. And our evidence finds that executive orders are unchanged for, on average, 12 years, meaning the policy reversals they talk about don't happen. But even if you want to get into the nitty-gritty with their examples, let's talk about USAID. They say that if USAID was never created, it could never be cut. If USAID was never created, you could never save 91 million lives. That's a fact, and that's a benefit of the executive order. Moreover, the Paris Climate Accords that they talk about, we could have never joined without the executive order. The next reason to affirm is the weighing debate. Remember that if the crisis ravages this country, you can't see any of the benefits that they talk about. Their sole response is reliant on this idea of the policy flip-flop happening, but I've already responded to that. That said, let's get on to our argument about crisis, another place to affirm. There are 3 reasons why Congress is systematically too slow to act during crisis. The first is log rolling, the second is the fact that Congress would have too much on its plate, and the third is the fact that partisan competition means that Congress members are too concerned about winning re-election. As a result, we saw during COVID that Biden's executive order was needed to save 1.4 million lives. They tell you that Congress was first. That's great. This is not a debate about choosing between the president or Congress. Executive orders supplement Congress and still save additional lives. That is offense for the affirmative.
I'll talk about, like, on their case, whether executive orders were necessary in the first place, and then I'll talk about the harms of executive orders uniquely. They might make a lot of generalizations, but you should ask yourself, which example are they actually winning on? If they want to prove a specific trend, they should at least be able to cite one specific empiric. But every single time, we have proven that executive orders aren't necessary. First of all, Congress can act a lot faster, which is proven in our own example of code, where they can see that the CARES Act was passed before the first executive order. But second of all, every single executive order that they say supplemented it didn't need to be an executive order. The reason is because when Congress wants the president to act during an emergency, they specifically give them emergency appropriations in the bills and legislation that they cite through statutory authority, which is why during the CARES Act, they authorized Operation Warp Speed, which gave the president the ability to do vaccine production. Yes, it was through executive order, but it didn't need to be, which is the exact analysis which they say we should be analyzing the nature of them specifically. The same thing is on this USAID thing. We argue that if USAID wasn't created through executive order, it wouldn't be subject to policy reversal like HIV cuts, which have killed over 100,000. If you had long-standing policy like Congress passes, like the ACE Kids Act, you would have actual deliberated and well thought out things that won't be reversed and have 300,000 kids saved through healthcare. Now, this functionally means they cannot access their crisis prerequisite because there's no need for executive orders. It's not unique. If anything, you should be looking where it causes harm. The first is on bypassing Congress. Right now, presidents only use executive orders when they want to justify a national emergency, even though the broad trend proves that there is now no longer any national emergencies and they're just enacting their own agenda to bypass Congress. They say checks and balances solved, but one, the damage is already done. You can't reverse the 100,000 lives lost from it. But then second of all, even if they checks and balances, this is still an argument to vote off it on our policy reversal argument. Checks and balances through executive orders are terrible because they leave no legal clarification on the policies and nothing gets done, which is an unanswered prerequisite on their crisis argument. It means that we cannot pass effective policy. But moreover, saying that most of them aren't reversed doesn't matter because the ones that are politically charged thus, the 25,000 people that die every single year from climate change reversal or the 135 million immigrants are not just blank numbers on a slate. Executive orders are uniquely harmful and they aren't needed for crisis. Good round. And thank you for everyone for taking your time.